Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, where the dust never settles and legends are forged in gunpowder and grit. Before we delve into today's story, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single tale from the Untamed West. Now, gather around the campfire, folks, and listen to a story of betrayal, survival, and vengeance. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down upon the cracked, thirsty earth of the Arizona Territory. For Jedediah Jed Stone, its heat was the last thing he truly felt, the last warmth before the cold of his own blood began to pool beneath him. He tasted dust and copper, his vision blurring the faces of the men who stood over him, his partners. Or so he thought. For 3 grueling months, they had hunted the fabled lost Dutchman's mine, a fool's errand to most. But they had found it. A thick, glittering vein of pure gold, nestled deep in the unforgiving heart of the Superstition Mountains. Enough to make them all kings. Silas the Viper Kane was the one holding the smoking pistol. His skeletal frame was a black silhouette against the blinding sun, his face a mask of cruel satisfaction. Jed had known Silas the longest, trusted him like a brother. That was his first mistake. The others, a rough collection of men bound by greed, shuffled their feet. There was Grizzly Adams, a mountain of a man with fists like boulders and a mind as dull as a river stone. There was Lefty Pete, a twitchy, weasel-faced man who couldn't meet Jed's fading gaze. And finally Kane, a quiet, cold-eyed gunslinger who'd been with them only a month, his face as impassive as if he were watching paint dry. "Gold's a heavy burden, Jed," Silas hissed, his voice like sand scraping on rock. "We figured we'd lighten your load. A quarter share is good. A third is better." Jed tried to push himself up, a useless gesture. The fire in his gut was spreading, a white-hot agony from the bullet Silas had planted in him without a word of warning. They'd been packing the last of their onto the mules. Jed had turned his back, pulling a rope, and the world had exploded in a flash of thunder and pain. "Silas, why?" Jed coughed, a spray of crimson staining his lips. Silas chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. He knelt, his face uncomfortably close to Jed's. His breath stank of cheap whiskey and decay. "Why?" "Because you're a fool, Jedediah. You see partners. I see obstacles. You see a future building a ranch, settling down with that pretty little picture you keep in your locket. I see power. This gold ain't for buying cattle. It's for buying towns. For buying fear. You wouldn't have understood." He reached into Jed's shirt pocket and pulled out a small, silver locket, tarnished with sweat and dust. He flipped it open. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Eleanor. The reason he'd taken this desperate gamble in the first place. "A sentimental man," Silas sneered, snapping the locket shut and pocketing it. "That's what makes you weak." He stood up and kicked Jed hard in the ribs. A sharp crack echoed in the silence, followed by Jed's choked gasp. "Finish him," Silas commanded, turning his back. Grizzly Adams lumbered forward, pulling a large skinning knife from his belt. He hesitated, his vacant eyes showing a flicker of something that pity, but perhaps a primitive reluctance to butcher a man he'd shared beans with just that morning. "I ain't sure, Silas," Grizzly mumbled. "Shootin' is one thing, but this—" "Do it," Kane said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He hadn't moved a muscle, his hand resting near the butt of his Colt. "Or I will. Makes no difference to the cut." That was all the motivation Grizzly needed. Fear of Kane overrode any other feeling. He raised the knife. Jed closed his eyes, his mind flashing back to the moment they found the vein. The wild whoops of joy, the disbelieving laughter, Silas slapping him on the back, calling him brother. It all felt like a lifetime ago. He thought of Eleanor, of the promise he'd made to her grave that he would build a life she would have been proud of. Now, all that would be buried with him in this God-forsaken dust. But the final blow never came. "Leave him," Silas suddenly said, his voice sharp. Grizzly paused, the knife glinting in the sun. "Let the coyotes and the heat do the work. It's more fitting. Let him die slow, thinking about how rich we're gonna be." He turned to look down at Jed one last time, a final, contemptuous smirk on his face. "Enjoy the dust, Jedediah." Lefty Pete, who had been silent the whole time, finally spoke, his voice trembling. "But what if someone finds him?" "Finds him," Silas laughed, a full-throated, ugly sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "Look around you, you damn fool. We're 50 miles from anything that could be called a town. The buzzards will have his eyes before sundown. By tomorrow, he'll be nothing but bones and regret." They mounted their horses, the mules heavily laden with canvas bags of gold ore. They didn't look back. They just rode away, their shapes shimmering in the oppressive heat until they were swallowed by the horizon, leaving Jed alone with the circling buzzards and the vast, indifferent silence of the desert. Jed lay there, his lifeblood seeping into the thirsty ground. The world began to shrink, his vision tunneling until all he could see was the endless, pale blue sky. He felt a strange coldness spreading through him, a stark contrast to the searing sun on his skin. He was dying. He knew it. But as his consciousness began to fray, one thought, one single, burning ember, refused to be extinguished. It wasn't a prayer. It wasn't a memory of Eleanor. It was a promise. A vow whispered to the dust and the vultures. He saw Silas's sneering face in his mind. He saw Grizzly's brutish hesitation, Lefty Pete's cowardice, and Kane's cold indifference. He burned their faces into his memory. As the darkness finally swarmed in, claiming him, his lips formed a single, silent word. Silas. The dust began to blow, a hot, gritty wind that started to cover his body, a premature burial shroud. To any passerby, he would have been just another forgotten soul claimed by the harshness of the West. They had left him for dead. They were wrong. Death would have been a mercy, and mercy had just ridden out of the valley. Time, for Jedediah's stone, ceased to be a river and became a stagnant, foul pool of torment. He drifted in and out of a blistering reality, a state of being that was less life and more a stubborn refusal to die. His world was reduced to a few primal, agonizing sensations, the searing fire in his belly where Silas's bullet had torn through him, the raw, sandpaper scrape of his tongue against the roof of a mouth caked with dried blood and grit, and the relentless, suffocating weight of the sun. He was a piece of meat left on an anvil, and the sun was the blacksmith's hammer, beating the life from him with every passing hour. Vultures, like black-robed undertakers, circled high above, patient and knowing. They had seen this play out 1,000 times. The desert always won. He dreamt, not of peaceful pastures or the cool embrace of a mountain stream, but of fire and betrayal. He saw Silas's face, magnified and distorted, the viper-like eyes glittering with avarice. The dry, rattling chuckle echoed in the chambers of his skull, a sound more terrible than a rattlesnake's warning. He felt the phantom kick to his ribs again and again, each blow stealing a breath he didn't have. He saw Eleanor in these fevered visions, but she was distant, standing on the far side of a river of blood. She didn't smile. She just watched him, her kind eyes filled with a sorrow that was a greater pain than any physical wound. He tried to call to her, to explain, but his throat was filled with dust. He was failing her. He was dying a failure. It was this thought, more than any instinct for survival, that anchored him. The promise. A life she would have been proud of. This wasn't it. This ignoble end, food for scavengers, was a desecration of her memory. The ember of vengeance that had sparked in his final conscious moments began to glow, fed by the bellows of his fevered rage. He would not die here. He could not. The universe owed him more than that. It owed him a reckoning. He had no idea how many suns had risen and set. 2, 3. His body was shutting down. The pain was becoming a dull, distant thrum. The cold was setting in, a deep, internal chill that the Arizona sun could not touch. This was it, the final surrender. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, the last of the air in his lungs. The sky above began to darken, the edges of his vision closing in. And then, a shadow fell over him. It wasn't the fleeting shadow of a circling vulture. It was solid, human. A figure knelt beside him, blocking the sun. All Jed could see was a silhouette against the blinding light. The face was ancient, carved with the deep lines of a life lived under this same brutal sun. The man's hair was long and gray, held back by a simple leather band. He wore buckskin leggings and a faded cotton shirt. His eyes, dark and deep-set, held the wisdom of the mountains themselves. He looked at Jed not with pity, but with a calm, praising curiosity, the way a man might study a resilient desert plant that refused to wither. The old man gently prodded the wound with a gnarled finger, his touch surprisingly soft. He grunted, a low sound of both diagnosis and respect. He then placed a hand on Jed's chest, feeling the faint, fluttering beat of his heart. The spirit fights, the man whispered, his voice raspy, like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. The body has given up, but the spirit has not yet chosen to walk the sky road. Using a strength that belied his age, the old man carefully worked his hands under Jed's broken body. Lifting him was an effort, but it was done with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. As Jed was lifted from the ground that had so nearly become his grave, his world finally went black, but this time, it was not the darkness of death, but the prelude to a new beginning. Jed awoke to coolness and shadow. For a moment, he thought he was in his grave, but the air was clean and dry, carrying the faint, earthy scent of herbs and stone. He was lying on a soft pallet of animal furs inside a shallow cave. The entrance was a narrow slit, letting in a sliver of daylight that illuminated the simple, yet profound, order of the space. Bunches of dried herbs hung from the rock ceiling. A small, smokeless fire glowed in a pit lined with stones, over which a clay pot bubbled quietly. The old man was there, grinding something in a stone bowl. He didn't look up as Jed's eyes fluttered open. He seemed to sense it. "You are awake," he stated, not as a question. "Good. The fever will break soon, or it will cook your mind and you will speak with the spirits for the rest of your short days." Jed tried to speak, but only a dry croak came out. The man brought a gourd of water to his lips, and Jed drank greedily. It was the sweetest thing he had ever tasted. "Who?" he managed to rasp. "I am Chayton," the old man said, his eyes finally meeting Jed's. "This is my home. You were dying in my garden." He gestured vaguely toward the cave entrance. "The desert is my garden. It gives what is needed." For days that bled into one another, Chayton nursed Jed. He cleaned the festering bullet wound, packing it with a poultice of chewed herbs that stung like fire but drew out the infection. He fed Jed thin, savory broths made from desert plants and the occasional rabbit he'd snared. He spoke little, and when he did, it was in a mixture of broken English and his native Apache tongue. He moved with a purpose and a stillness that Jed found mesmerizing. He was a part of this harsh landscape, not a conqueror of it. The fever was a long and terrible battle. Jed was lost in its inferno, wrestling with the ghosts of his betrayal. He screamed Silas's name in his sleep. He cried for Eleanor. He fought and thrashed against unseen enemies. Through it all, Chayton was a constant presence. He would hold Jed down, bathing his brow with cool water, and chant low, rhythmic songs that seemed to be the only thing that could soothe the tormented landscape of Jed's mind. One evening, as the purple shadows of twilight stretched across the land, the fever broke. Jed awoke drenched in sweat, his body weak and aching, but his mind was clear for the first time in what felt like an eternity. He was terribly thin, a scarecrow of a man, but he was alive. The fire in his gut had been replaced by a hollow emptiness. Chayton sat by the fire, sharpening a flint knife. "The spirit has won the battle," he said without looking up. Now the man must decide if the victory was worth the cost. Over the next few weeks, Jed's strength slowly returned. He learned to sit up, then to stand, his legs trembling like a newborn foal's. The pain in his side was a constant, gnawing companion, a physical reminder of the debt he was owed. He would spend hours staring out of the cave mouth at the vast, unforgiving expanse of the desert, his thoughts dark and circular. "He took something from me," Jed said one day, his voice still rough from disuse. He was sitting by the fire, watching Chayton weave a basket from yucca fibers. "More than the gold." Chayton's fingers never stopped their intricate work. "A man carries many things. His pride, his trust, his picture of the world. What did they take from you?" "Everything," Jed answered, the word a stone in his throat. He touched his chest, where the locket used to be. The empty space felt like another wound. "They took my future." "No," Chayton corrected him gently. "They took your past. You are the one who must build a new future. You can build it from stone and plant it with corn, or you can build it from bones and water it with blood. The desert does not care. It will accept either." As his body mended, Jed began to change. The easygoing nature that had marked him before was gone, burned away by the fever and the betrayal. In its place was a hard, cold resolve. A silence fell over him, not the peaceful silence of Chayton, but the watchful, predatory silence of a cougar waiting in the rocks. He helped Chayton with his daily tasks, gathering roots, checking snares, fetching water. His hands, once skilled at judging the weight of ore, learned the feel of the land. His eyes, Once quick to spot the glint of gold, learned to read the subtle signs of a track in the sand. One day, Chayton led him out of the cave and handed him a simple, sturdy bow and a quiver of arrows. "Your body is healed," the old Apache said, "but your muscles are water. Your spirit is a hungry fire, but it lives in a weak house. You must rebuild the house." So Jed began to train. At first, it was humiliating. He could barely draw the bowstring. His arrows wobbled and fell short. His patched-up body screamed in protest. But every time he wanted to quit, he would see Silas's sneering face, and the rage would give him strength. He pushed himself past pain, past exhaustion. He hunted jackrabbits and quail, learning the patience of the stalk, the economy of the kill. His body hardened, the soft flesh of the prospector replaced with the lean, corded muscle of the survivor. The scar on his side was a puckered, angry red, a permanent brand of his new identity. He found the remnants of his gear not far from where Chayton had found him. His gun belt, with his Colt Peacemaker still holstered, had been half buried in the sand. The gun was fouled with dust and grit, but it was salvageable. He spent days cleaning it, meticulously oiling each part until the action was smooth as silk. It felt heavier in his hand now. It was no longer just a tool for protection. It was an instrument of judgment. He set up target stones, pieces of driftwood, the bleached skulls of animals. And he practiced. From sunup to sundown, the canyon echoed with the crack of his Colt. He wasn't just shooting. He was rehearsing. Each target had a name. Silas, Grizzly, Lefty, Kane. He learned to draw with a speed that was a blur of motion. He learned to fire from the hip, to shoot while moving, to reload without thinking. He was no longer just a man with a gun. He and the Colt were becoming one entity, a single engine of destruction. Chayton watched this transformation with sad, knowing eyes. He never interfered, never judged. He had seen what the white man's world did to people, how it turned good men toward violence and greed. He saw the poison of vengeance taking root in Jed's soul, choking out whatever else might have grown there. One evening, as they shared a meal of roasted quail, Chayton spoke. "I once walked the warpath," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "I took scalps. I sang songs of death for my enemies. My heart was filled with a fire like yours. And when it was over, when my enemies were dust, I looked at my hands. They were covered in blood that would not wash off. My heart was empty. The fire had burned everything inside me, leaving only ash. Be careful, Jedediah Stone. The path you walk is a lonely one, and it leads only to the grave." "They left me for dead, Chayton," Jed said, his voice low and cold as iron. "They deserve nothing less." "Every man receives what he deserves," Chayton replied. "But it is not for you to decide the payment. The spirits keep their own ledger." Jed shook his head. "The spirits didn't pull me from the dust. You did. You saved my life, and I am grateful for it. But you didn't save it so I could go back to digging in the dirt. You saved it for this. For the reckoning." Chayton saw the finality in Jed's eyes and knew there were no more words to be said. The boy he had pulled from the sand was gone. In his place stood something new, something hard and dangerous. The day finally came. Jed was fully healed, stronger and faster than he had ever been in his life. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced death and found it wanting. He had packed a small satchel with dried meat, a water skin, and a box of ammunition. Chayton had traded some herbs in a distant village for a horse, a tough, weary Mustang that had the same resilient spirit as Jed himself. Jed mounted the horse, looking down at the old Apache who had saved him. Words felt small and useless. "I don't know how to thank you, Chayton." "Live," Chayton said simply. "That will be thanks enough. And perhaps one day, when the fire has burned itself out, you will remember what it is to be a man, not just a ghost." He pressed a small, smooth stone into Jed's hand. "I charm for your journey, to remind you that even the hardest things are shaped by time and patience." Jed nodded, tucking the stone into his pocket. He looked out at the horizon, towards the sprawling, chaotic world of men and greed. He had no gold. He had no locket. He had nothing but the clothes on his back, a gun on his hip, and a list of 4 names seared into his soul. It was enough. He turned the horse and, without a backward glance, rode out of the canyon. The setting sun cast his long shadow before him, a dark specter stretching across the blood-red land. He was no longer Jedediah Stone, the hopeful prospector. That man had died in the dust, under the guns of his partners. The man who rode now was someone else entirely. He was a promise of violence. He was the reckoning. And he was coming. The settlement of Dust Devil Gulch was less a town and more a festering wound on the face of the desert. It consisted of a single, rutted street lined with a dozen sun-bleached, ramshackle buildings, a saloon with warped bat-wing doors, a general store whose windows were opaque with grime, a livery stable that smelled of decay, and a handful of shacks that housed the town's desperate and transient population. The air was thick with the reek of cheap whiskey and washed bodies, and the ever-present, choking dust that gave the place its name. It was the perfect place to disappear, or to find someone who had. It was a magnet for men with heavy pasts and light futures. Jed rode in slowly, not on the weary Mustang Chayton had given him, but on a powerful, dark-coated gelding he had acquired from a pair of wanted men whose luck had run out 2 days prior. The Mustang was safely stabled in a small, hidden canyon, a lesson in prudence taught by the old Apache. Jed himself was almost unrecognizable from the prospector who had left civilization months ago. His face was leaner, tanned to the color of old leather, and etched with lines that hadn't been there before. His eyes, once quick to smile, were now perpetually narrowed, constantly scanning, assessing, judging. They were the eyes of a predator, and they made people in Dust Devil Gulch a town of predators instantly uneasy. He wore simple, durable clothes caked with the dust of the trail, and a low-slung gun belt that had become as much a part of him as his own skin. He dismounted in front of the saloon, the Thirsty Coyote, and tied his horse to the hitching rail. As he did, he felt the weight of stares from the men loitering on the covered boardwalk. They sized him up, the horse, the gun, the cold set of his jaw. They saw a man who was not to be trifled with, and their gazes slid away. Jed pushed through the saloon doors, stepping from the blinding sun into a cool, gloomy interior that smelled of stale beer and regret. The place was sparsely populated for midday. A few grizzled prospectors nursed their drinks at a long, scarred bar. A card game was underway in a corner, the players' faces hidden by the shadows of their hat brims. The bartender, a portly man with a sweaty brow and a dirty apron, gave Jed a cursory glance and went back to wiping a glass with a rag that only seemed to redistribute the filth. Jed walked to the bar and laid a coin down. It was one of the few he had taken from the wanted men. "Whiskey," he said, his voice a low rasp. The bartender poured a shot of amber liquid from an unlabeled bottle. Jed took the glass but didn't drink. He scanned the room in the grimy mirror behind the bar. He was listening. In a place like this, information was the most valuable currency, often traded in careless whispers. He needed a scent, a trail. For men with that much gold couldn't vanish completely. Greed was a loud and sloppy master. Sooner or later, one of them would make a mistake. He took a slow sip of the whiskey. It burned a path down his throat. He had been without alcohol for so long that the effect was immediate and sharp, honing his senses rather than dulling them. For an hour, he stood there, a silent statue at the end of the bar, nursing that single drink, absorbing the rhythm of the room. He learned who was a regular, who was a drifter, who was winning at cards, and who was drowning their sorrows. The first hint came from a conversation between 2 old prospectors further down the bar. "Purest stuff I ever did see," one of them was saying, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Not from around here. Had the look of the superstitions on it, I'd wager. Fella came through about a month back, a big fella, looked like a bear walking on its hind legs. Bought the whole town around, paid with a nugget the size of my thumb." Jed's posture didn't change, but his attention sharpened to a razor's edge. "A big fella, looked like a bear. Grizzly, paid with a nugget, you say?" The other prospector scoffed. "Fool's move. Might as well paint a target on your back. That's what I reckon. Ain't seen him since. Probably dead in a ditch somewhere." His poke a whole lot lighter. So, Grizzly had come this way. Alone. Which meant they had likely split up. A smart move. For men with a fortune were a target. For men with a quarter of a fortune could blend in more easily. Jed finished his whiskey and slid the glass back. He needed more. This was a cold trail, a month old. He needed something fresher. His eyes drifted to the card game. Poker. The great equalizer and the great revealer. A man's character was laid bare at the poker table, his courage, his cunning, his tells. And often, a man with a full purse and a loose tongue could be coaxed into revealing more than just his hand. He needed a stake to get into the game. He walked over to the table. 4 men were playing, their faces grim. A pile of coins and worn bills sat in the center. "Room for one more?" Jed asked, his voice even. One of the players, a man with a jagged scar across his cheek, looked up. "Game's 5-card stud. $10 buy-in. You got the sand for it, stranger." Jed met his gaze and let the silence hang for a moment before dropping a $10 gold piece on the table. The coin, also from the dead bounty hunters, shone with a luster that made the other player's currency look dull. "I've got the sand," Jed said, pulling up a chair. For the next 2 hours, Jed played a quiet, patient game. He won a few small pots, lost a few. He wasn't playing to win, not yet. He was playing to listen. He folded more often than he played, using the time to absorb the chatter of the room. The talk was of cattle prices, of Apache raids to the south, of a new marshal in a town called Prosperity Wells who was cracking down on gunslingers. And then he heard it. The bartender was talking to a dusty cowboy who had just come in. "Weasel-faced little fella," the cowboy was saying, nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. "Flashing more gold coin than I've ever seen." Heard him bragging to one of the girls at the cat house in Prosperity Wells that he and his partners had hit the mother lode. Said he was headed west, maybe to California, to live like a king. Jed's hand, which was holding a pair of aces, didn't so much as twitch. Weasel-faced. Nervous. That was Lefty Pete. And the trail was fresh. Prosperity Wells. That was where the new, tough marshal was. An odd place for a man on the run to go, unless he thought the law would protect him from other, lawless threats. Lefty was a coward. It made perfect sense. He would seek shelter in the shadow of a badge, hoping it would hide him from the ghosts of his past. Jed laid his cards down. Fold. He played for another 30 minutes, his mind no longer on the game but on the road ahead. He had what he needed. 2 leads. One cold, one hot. He would follow the hot one first. Lefty was the weak link, the one most likely to break and give up the locations of the others. The scar-faced man was dealing a new hand. Jed looked at his cards, 2 kings, the king of spades and the king of hearts. A king for vengeance, a king for the love he had lost. He felt a cold certainty settle over him. He pushed his entire stack of winnings into the center of the table. "All of it," he said. The other players, startled by his sudden aggression, looked at their cards, then at Jed's impassive face. One by one, they folded, until only the scar-faced man was left. He chewed on his lip, studying Jed. "You're bluffing, stranger." "There's one way to find out," Jed said, his voice flat. The man cursed, hesitated, and then threw his cards into the muck. "Damn you. The pot's yours." Jed raked in the money, his expression unchanging. He hadn't even looked at his other 3 cards. He stood up, pocketing the cash. It was more than enough to get him to Prosperity Wells and sustain him for a while. As he turned to leave, the scar-faced man stood up. "Hold on. I want a chance to win that back." "The game is over," Jed said, not looking back. "I say when it's over," the man snarled, his hand dropping towards his gun. Jed stopped. The saloon went dead quiet. The lazy buzzing of a fly could be heard. Without turning, Jed spoke, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. "You have a choice. You can sit back down and finish your drink. Or you can die with your hand on your gun. It makes no difference to me. But I'd hate for your friends to have to clean you off the floor." The threat was so calm, so matter-of-fact, that it was more terrifying than any angry shout. The scar-faced man froze, his fingers hovering over the handle of his pistol. He saw his own reflection in the bar mirror, and he saw the stranger's eyes watching him in that same reflection. There was nothing in those eyes. No fear, no anger, just a vast, cold emptiness. He slowly, deliberately, raised his hand and placed it flat on the table. Jed walked out of the saloon without a backward glance, the batwing doors swinging shut behind him. He untied his horse, mounted up, and rode out of Dust Devil Gulch, leaving the town and its whispers behind. He now had a destination and a name. He had the scent. The dust of the trail ahead was no longer aimless. It was a path leading straight to the first man on his list. The hunt had begun. Prosperity Wells was everything Dust Devil Gulch was not. Its wide, clean streets were lined with handsome two-story buildings, their freshly painted signs advertising a bank, a land office, and a hotel that boasted real feather beds. The town hummed with the sound of commerce and ambition. It had a church with a real steeple and a marshal's office with glass in its windows. It was a town built on the promise of a lawful, civilized future, a place where a man with money could feel safe, protected by the rule of law from the chaos of the frontier. It was the perfect hiding place for a man like Lefty Pete. Jed rode into town looking like just another trail-weary drifter, a deliberate disguise. He stabled his horse and took a cheap room in a boarding house on the edge of town, far from the respectable hotel. He paid in advance, using the money he'd won in the poker game, and gave a false name. He was a ghost, a phantom. The less attention he drew to himself, the better. For 2 days, he simply watched. He sat on a bench across from the bank. He drank sarsaparilla in the corner of the fanciest saloon. He loitered near the general store. He learned the town's rhythms, the marshal's patrol routes, and the faces of its citizens. And he looked for a weasel. He found him on the 3rd day. Lefty Pete came out of the hotel, and Jed recognized him instantly, though he was much changed. He was wearing a gaudy plaid suit and a derby hat, looking like a cheap imitation of a city gentleman. He was clean-shaven, but the nervous, twitchy energy was still there. His eyes darted back and forth, constantly scanning the street, never resting. He was a man trying desperately to look like he belonged, but his fear clung to him like a foul cologne. Jed watched as Lefty strutted over to the saloon, his walk an unconvincing swagger. He was living high, but he was living scared. Jed didn't act immediately. Vengeance was not a dish to be served hot and reckless. Chayton had taught him the patience of the hunter. So, he watched Lefty for another day, studying his habits. Lefty had a routine. He would wake late, have a large breakfast at the hotel restaurant, and the afternoon playing cards and mostly losing at the saloon, visit the cat house on the edge of town as dusk fell, and then stumble back to his hotel room, drunk and alone. He was a creature of pathetic, predictable habits. The time came on the 5th night. A cool breeze was blowing through the streets, carrying the scent of rain. Jed had watched Lefty lose a significant amount of gold at the poker table, his drunken boasts growing louder and more desperate with each loss. He saw him leave the saloon and weave his way toward the cat house. Jed melted into the shadows of an alleyway and waited. An hour later, Lefty emerged, looking even more disheveled. He started his stumbling walk back toward the hotel, cutting through a dark, narrow alley between the general store and the blacksmith's forge, a shortcut Jed had seen him use before. It was the perfect spot. As Lefty passed the deepest part of the shadow, a hand shot out and grabbed the front of his suit, slamming him against the rough brick wall. The air was knocked from his lungs in a surprised grunt. Before he could even cry out, the cold, hard circle of a gun barrel was pressed firmly under his chin, forcing his head back at a painful angle. "Fancy suit, Lefty," a voice whispered from the darkness, a voice that was both terrifyingly familiar and chillingly different. "Must have cost a pretty penny." Lefty Pete's eyes widened in sheer terror. He couldn't see the face in the gloom, but he knew the voice. It was a voice from a nightmare, a voice that should have been silenced by dust and death weeks ago. "Jed? No, it can't be. You're dead. We saw you. You saw what you wanted to see." Jed's voice rasped, cold as a tombstone. The gun pressed harder. "You left me for the buzzards. But I'm not as easy to kill as you hoped." Lefty started to blubber, his false courage dissolving into a puddle of whiskey-soaked fear. "Jed, I swear, it wasn't my idea. It was Silas. It was all Silas. He made us do it. I never wanted to hurt you. I swear on my mother's grave." "Your mother must have been a saint to bear a snake like you," Jed said, his voice devoid of any emotion. He pushed Lefty along the alley, towards the back door of the blacksmith's forge. He checked it earlier. It was unlocked. He shoved Lefty inside, into the darkness that smelled of coal smoke and hot iron. He kicked the door shut, plunging them into near-total blackness. "What do you want, Jed?" "Money," Lefty pleaded, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "I'll give you my share. All of it. Just let me go. I'll disappear. You'll never see me again." "Your money is already mine, Lefty." "It was always mine," Jed said. A match scraped against the wall, and the sudden flare of light illuminated his face. Lefty gasped. This wasn't the face of the man he had betrayed. The friendly eyes were gone, replaced by chips of cold flint. The scar on his side was visible through a tear in his shirt, a livid reminder of their crime. Jed lit a lantern that sat on the anvil, casting long, dancing shadows across the workshop. I want names, Lefty. Locations. Where did you all go? We split up, Lefty cried, shrinking back. It was Silas's idea. Said it was safer. We split the gold 4 ways and rode out. Where did Silas and Kane go? South. Talked about Mexico, maybe buying up land, starting their own little empire. Silas, he's got big plans, Jed. He's not just a prospector, he's something else. He was talking about controlling a whole valley, the water rights, everything. Silas. Even his name was a venomous hiss. And Grizzly. North. Headed for the mountains. Said he was sick of people. Wanted to find a quiet spot and build a cabin, live like a hermit. That's all I know, Jed, I swear. Lefty was sobbing now, tears and snot running down his face. Please, Jed, have mercy. Jed stared at him, his face an unreadable mask in the lantern light. Mercy, he repeated, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. Did you show me mercy when you stood by and watched Silas shoot me? Did you show me mercy when you rode away and left me to bleed into the sand? Did you feel any mercy when you spent my gold on cheap suits and whores? Jed reached into his own pocket and pulled something out. It was a plain, smooth stone one Chayton had given him. He held it up. An old man told me that even the hardest things are shaped by time and patience. You and the others, you took a man and you tried to break him. But you didn't. You just ground him down, made him harder. He tossed the stone onto the anvil with a loud clink. He then raised the colt, the hammer clicking back with a sound that seemed to echo the finality of doom. No, Lefty screamed, scrambling backward and tripping over a pile of horseshoes. Please, when you get to hell, Jed said, his voice a dead calm, tell the devil that Jedediah Stone sent you, and that I'm coming for the others. The roar of the cold peacemaker was deafening in the enclosed space. The flash lit up the forge for a split second, a single, brutal to blow of judgment. Lefty Pete's body was thrown back against a stack of wagon wheels, a dark hole appearing on the front of his gaudy suit. He slid to the floor and lay still. The silence that followed was profound. The only sound was the gentle hiss of the lantern. Jed stood there for a long moment, the smoke curling from the barrel of his gun. He felt nothing. No satisfaction, no remorse. Just a cold, hollow emptiness. One name was crossed off the list. He calmly reloaded the empty chamber, his movements precise and economical. He took the thick leather pouch of gold from Lefty's inside pocket. He looked down at the dead man, a pathetic heap of cheap ambition and cowardice. He then turned, extinguished the lantern, and slipped out the back door, disappearing into the night as quietly as he had come. The coming rain would wash his tracks away. Two names south, one named north. The trail was now clear. The high country was a different world. The oppressive heat of the desert gave way to the crisp, pine-scented air of the mountains. Here, the land was vertical, a jagged landscape of granite peaks, dense forests, and deep, shadowed canyons where the sun barely reached. It was a place of profound beauty and unforgiving danger. It was exactly the kind of place a man like Grizzly Adams would go to ground. Jed had been tracking him for 3 weeks. The information from Lefty had been a starting point, but north to the mountains covered a vast and tame territory. Jed had to rely on the skills Chayton had taught him. He became a ghost in the wilderness, living off the land, his senses attuned to every broken twig, every faint track, every subtle sign that a man had passed this way. He found Grizzly's trail at a remote trading post, where the clerk remembered a giant of a man trading a heavy gold nugget for a ridiculous amount of flour, salt, traps, and a new axe. The trail was weeks old, but it was a start. The hunt was a slow, methodical process. It was a test of everything Jed had become. He followed the signs of a large man, clumsy in his passage, leaving a trail a child could follow at first. But as the days wore on, the tracks became fainter. Grizzly was moving deeper into the wilderness, into places where few men dared to go. The hunter in Jed respected it. Grizzly was no coward like Lefty. He was a creature of the wild, and on this terrain, he was in his element. Jed's own skills were tested daily. He survived a flash flood that turned a dry creek bed into a raging torrent. He faced down a she-bear protecting her cubs, a tense standoff that ended only when he showed no aggression and slowly backed away. He learned to think like the mountain, to be patient like the stone and persistent like the river. During the long, cold nights, sitting by a small, smokeless fire as Chayton had shown him, he would feel the gnawing loneliness of his quest. But then he would remember Silas's sneer and Eleanor's locket, and the cold resolve would settle over him once more. He finally found Grizzly's camp in a small, box canyon accessible only by a single, narrow game trail. A crude but sturdy log cabin was built against a rock face, a thin plume of smoke rising from its mud and stick chimney. It was a well-chosen spot, defensible, with a clear spring nearby and abundant game. Grizzly had found his sanctuary. For a full day, Jed watched from a high ridge, hidden amongst the pines and boulders. He studied the cabin, the layout of the canyon, and Grizzly's routine. The big man was like a bear, as his name suggested. He spent his days checking his trap lines, chopping wood, and working on his cabin. He was powerful, moving massive logs with seemingly little effort. He was always armed, a large caliber rifle leaning against a tree or slung over his shoulder, and a huge skinning knife was always on his belt. A direct assault would be suicide. Grizzly was a force of nature, and Jed knew he couldn't match his raw strength. He would have to use his cunning. Jed decided to make his move at dusk, when the fading light would provide cover. He slipped down from the ridge, moving with the silence of a shadow. He carried only his Colt and a knife. A rifle would be too cumbersome for what he had planned. He circled around the back of the cabin, using the terrain to mask his approach. He found what he was looking for, the woodpile. Grizzly's axe was sunk into a large shopping block nearby. He waited. As the last light of the sun painted the western peaks in hues of orange and purple, Grizzly came out of the cabin, stretching his massive arms. He walked to the spring to fill a bucket. This was the moment. Jed slipped from the shadows and moved to the front of the cabin. He didn't enter. Instead, he took the heavy bar used to lock the door from the outside and dropped it into its brackets. He was trapping the bear in its own den. Grizzly returned from the spring, humming a tuneless dirge. He saw the barred door and stopped, his brow furrowing in confusion. He set the bucket down and shoved at the door. It didn't budge. "What in the—" "Hello, Grizzly," Jed's voice said, calm and clear, from the side of the cabin. The big man spun around, his eyes wide. He saw Jed standing 20 yards away, a silhouette against the twilight sky, his hand resting near the butt of his Colt. Recognition dawned, followed by disbelief, and then a primal, cornered animal fear. "Stone, you're supposed to be dead," Grizzly stammered, his hand instinctively going for the knife on his belt. "I got better," Jed said. "I came for what you owe me." "I ain't got nothing for you," Grizzly roared, his fear turning to rage. He drew the massive skinning knife. It was Silas. Always Silas. "You stood there, Grizzly. You were going to cut my throat before he stopped you. You're just as guilty as the rest," Jed stated, his voice flat. "Now, you have two choices. You can tell me what you know about Silas's plans, and I'll make this quick. Or you can die slow." Grizzly bellowed in fury and charged. He was terrifyingly fast for a man his size, closing the distance in a matter of seconds, the huge knife held high. Jed didn't flinch. He drew his Colt in a single, fluid motion. He didn't aim for the chest or the head. He fired once. The bullet struck Grizzly in the knee. The big man screamed, a sound of pure agony, and his leg buckled. He crashed to the ground, his charge ending in a cloud of dust and pine needles. He writhed on the ground, clutching his shattered knee. Jed walked forward slowly, the Colt still aimed at Grizzly's head. He stood over the wounded giant. "I'll ask you again. Silas, what was he planning?" "Go to hell," Grizzly spat, his face contorted in pain and hate. He lunged from the ground, swiping with the knife. Jed sidestepped easily, the blade slicing through empty air. He brought the barrel of the Colt down hard on Grizzly's wrist. A sickening crunch echoed in the canyon, and the knife fell from the big man's nerveless fingers. Jed kicked the knife away. He knelt, pressing the gun to Grizzly's forehead. Last chance. Grizzly, broken and defeated, finally broke. He was meeting someone, he gasped. In Silver Creek. A man from the railroad. Something about a new spur line controlling the pass. Silas said gold buys guns, but controlling the path the gold travels on that buys a kingdom. Silver Creek. A railroad man. The pieces were starting to come together. Silas wasn't just running, he was building something. "And Kane?" Jed asked. "With Silas. Always with Silas. He's his shadow, his ghost." "You'll never get to Silas with Kane around," Grizzly groaned. "I'll worry about Kane later," Jed said, standing up. He looked down at the pathetic, broken man on the ground. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps a ghost of the man he used to be, a sliver of pity. But it vanished as quickly as it came. He remembered lying in the dust, the sun beating down, Grizzly standing over him with that same knife. "You wanted to live like a hermit, Grizzly," Jed said, his voice barely a whisper. "Now you'll be one with this canyon forever." He didn't use the gun again. It felt too impersonal. He picked up Grizzly's fallen knife. It felt heavy and crude in his hand. He looked at the cabin the man had built, the life he had tried to create with stolen gold. Chayden's words echoed in his mind, about building a future from bones and watering it with blood. Grizzly saw the look in Jed's eyes and the knife in his hand. "No, please." Jed turned and walked away, back towards the trail out of the canyon, leaving the knife on the ground. He left Grizzly there, bleeding and crippled, with a shattered knee and a broken wrist, miles from any hope of help. The coyotes and the cold mountain nights would do the rest. It was the kind of death they had left for him. As he climbed back to the ridge, he did not look back. He didn't need to down, to go. And now, he had a destination. Silver Creek, the heart of the Viper's Nest. The hunt was about to get much, much harder. Silver Creek was a town in the grip of a fever, and the disease was progress. The raw and tamed energy of the frontier was being hammered into shape by the relentless force of the railroad. The town was a chaotic symphony of construction, the clang of steel on steel, the shouts of foremen, the groan of lumber being hoisted into place for new saloons and hotels. It was a place choking on money and ambition, where fortunes were made and lost between sunrise and sunset. And at the center of this whirlwind, sitting like a spider in a newly spun web, was Silas Kane. Jedediah Stone entered Silver Creek not as a specter of vengeance, but as just another face in the crowd. He sold his horse, took a room in a noisy boarding house populated by railroad workers, and spent his first week doing nothing but watching and listening. He learned quickly that Silas was no longer just a prospector with a lucky strike. He was a pillar of the community, a founding investor. He had used his share of the gold not on whiskey and women, but on buying influence. He was a partner in the Grand Majestic Hotel, had a controlling interest in the freight company, and was the primary landowner of the valley through which the railroad would inevitably pass. He wore fine suits, smoked expensive cigars, and spoke of a grand future for Silver Creek. To the town, he was a visionary. To Jed, he was a viper who had simply found a bigger nest. And where Silas was, Kane was never far behind. Jed saw him often. Kane wasn't changed. He wore the same simple, dark clothes, the same impassive expression. He was Silas's shadow, a silent, ever-present threat. He rarely spoke, but his eyes missed nothing. He would stand at the edge of a room while Silas held court, a specter of violence in a place that pretended to be civilized. Jed knew, with a cold certainty, that getting to Silas meant going through Kane. And Kane was not Grizzly or Lefty. Kane was a professional, a true gunslinger. A direct confrontation would be a coin toss, and Jed had no intention of leaving his life to chance. Jed saw the trap Silas had built for himself. He was insulated by money and men. He had a half-dozen hired guns on his payroll, toughs who acted as his bodyguards and enforcers. The local marshal was firmly in his pocket, more concerned with keeping the railroad bosses happy than with dispensing any real justice. To attack Silas here, in his fortress of influence, would be suicide. Chayden's words came back to him, "You can build a future from stone or from bones." Silas was building his from stone, on a foundation of Jed's stolen gold. Jed knew he had to shatter that foundation. He had to draw the viper out of its nest. And he knew exactly what the bait had to be. More gold. The plan formed in his mind, a cold and intricate piece of machinery. It was a gambit, a dangerous play that would risk everything, but it was the only way. He needed a pawn. He found one in a smoky, low-rent saloon at the edge of town, a place the respectable citizens of Silver Creek avoided. The man's name was Old Man Hemlock, a grizzled, Down on his luck, prospector with shaking hands and the desperate hope of a man who has spent 40 years chasing a dream that was always just over the next ridge. He was perfect. Jed sat down at Hemlock's table, bought him a whiskey, and listened to his tales of near misses and stolen claims. Then, Jed leaned in, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "I know a man," Jed began, "who is getting too old for the mountains. He found something big, in the superstitions. But he's afraid to bring it out himself. Afraid of getting robbed." Hemlock's watery eyes sharpened with a flicker of interest. "The superstitions? That's a fool's graveyard. Nothing there but lost Dutchman myths." "Myths don't look like this," Jed said. He reached into a small leather pouch and slid a single, heavy nugget across the table. It wasn't large, but it was dense, and it gleamed with the unmistakable purity of the lode he and Silas had found. He had carried a few small pieces with him, knowing they might be useful. Hemlock picked it up, his eyes widening. He bit it. He scraped it with a dirty fingernail. The weight, the color, the texture, it was real. It was the kind of gold a man dreamed of. "My God," he breathed. "My friend wants to sell the location of the vein," Jed lied smoothly. "He doesn't want to work it. He just wants enough to retire in peace. He needs a man to act as a go-between. A man who knows gold, who can talk to the right people. He needs someone to take this nugget to the biggest player in town and tell him there's a river of it waiting for him. For a price." "Who?" Hemlock asked, his voice trembling with excitement. "Silas Kane," Jed said. "Take it to him. Tell him an old prospector sent you. Tell him the man who found it will meet him at the Twin Rock Spires, at the mouth of Weaver's Canyon, in 5 days. Kane will know the place. He is to come alone and bring $10,000 in cash. In exchange, he'll get the map." "10,000, Hemlock gasped. "And what's in it for me?" "You get to keep that nugget," Jed said. "And if you set the deal, my friend will give you $1,000 for your trouble." It was a perfect lure. The nugget was proof. The location, Weaver's Canyon, was close enough to the real mine to be plausible. The demand for Silas to come alone was something a cautious old prospector might ask for, but Jed knew Silas would never abide by it. He was too arrogant and too paranoid. He would come, but he would bring his army with him. And he would walk right into Jed's trap. Hemlock, his mind swimming with visions of wealth, agreed instantly. The next day, Jed watched from across the street as the old prospector, cleaned up as best he could, nervously entered the Grand Majestic Hotel. He was gone for a long time. When he emerged, he was walking on air, a broad, disbelieving smile on his face. He rushed back to the saloon, but Jed was already gone. The pawn had served his purpose. Jed spent the next 2 days preparing. He bought a new horse, a strong, dependable roan. He purchased supplies, ammunition, dried rations, canteens, and several coils of thick rope. He packed it all carefully onto a mule. As the sun set on the second day, he rode out of Silver Creek, heading southeast, back towards the jagged peaks of the Superstition Mountains. He was no longer the hunter. He was the bait, laying a trap for a much larger predator. He was leading them back to the place where it all began. Back to the dust. Back to the Devil's Anvil. The Superstition Mountains loomed on the horizon, their jagged peaks like broken teeth against the stark blue sky. To Jed, this was no longer a place of betrayal and death. It was his ground, his ally. Over the past months, he had become a part of its harsh and forgiving landscape. He knew its secrets, the hidden springs, the game trails that were invisible to the untrained eye, the canyons that echoed in such a way as to make one man sound like 3. He was the ghost here, and he was about to welcome his former partners home. He reached Weaver's Canyon 2 days before the scheduled meeting. He didn't go to the Twin Spires. That was the bait. The real trap was 2 miles deeper into the canyon system, and a narrow, winding gorge known by the old Apache as the Canyon of Whispering Winds. It was a perfect kill box. The canyon floor was barely 50 feet wide, with sheer and climbable rock walls rising hundreds of feet on either side. There was only one way in and one way out. For 48 hours, Jed worked with a tireless, methodical intensity. He wasn't preparing for a gunfight. He was preparing for a war. High above the canyon floor, on a precarious ledge overlooking a narrow bend, he used a crowbar and his own raw strength to loosen a massive overhang of rock and scree. He wedged several logs into place, creating a crude but effective deadfall trap that could be triggered by cutting a single, taut rope. This would be his gate, to be slammed shut once his prey was inside. Further down the canyon, he prepared his nests. He found 3 locations on the high ledges, accessible only through difficult, hand-over-hand climbs. Each offered a commanding view of the canyon floor, with excellent cover and clear fields of fire. In each nest, he stashed a small supply of water, jerky, and ammunition. He would not be trapped in one place. He would be everywhere and nowhere. He was turning the entire canyon into his weapon. On the morning of the 5th day, he was in position, high on the western ledge, concealed in a crevice that made him all but invisible from below. He lay on his stomach, his Winchester rifle resting on a flat rock, its barrel cool to the touch. He scanned the mouth of the canyon through a small spyglass. The sun climbed, the heat began to build, and the silence of the mountains was absolute. Around noon, they arrived. Jed smiled a cold, grim smile. Just as he had predicted, Silas had not come alone. He rode at the front, looking regal and impatient on a fine black stallion. Beside him was Cain, a silent sentinel, his eyes constantly scanning the canyon walls. And behind them were 8 hired guns, a rough-looking posse armed with rifles and pistols. 12 men in total. 12 men who had come for a map and were about to find their graves. They rode past the twin spires, moving cautiously into Weaver's Canyon. The hired guns were nervous, their heads on a swivel, and used to the profound silence and towering scale of the mountains. Cain seemed perfectly calm, but Jed could see the tension in the way he held his reins, the way his gaze lingered on the high ledges. He sensed the danger, even if he couldn't see it. Silas, however, was blinded by his own arrogance. He was the king coming to claim a prize, annoyed by the theatricality of it all. Jed let them ride deeper into the gorge, past his position. He waited until the entire party had rounded the narrow bend, directly below the deadfall trap he had prepared. He held his breath. This was the most critical moment. He raised his Winchester, took careful aim at the rope he had strung across the canyon, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle was like the sound of creation itself, shattering the silence and echoing endlessly between the canyon walls. The rope snapped. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a low groan that grew into a deafening roar, tons of rock, boulders, and scree tore loose from the ledge above. It cascaded down into the canyon, a terrifying avalanche of stone. The men and horses below screamed in panic. The landslide crashed onto the canyon floor exactly where Jed had intended, completely blocking the path they had just come down. A massive cloud of thick, choking dust filled the air, turning the bright day into a murky twilight. One of the hired guns and his horse were caught at the edge of the slide, crushed instantly under the falling boulders. Through the dust, Jed could hear Silas roaring orders, trying to restore calm, but his voice was drowned out by the terrified whinnying of the horses and the shouts of the panicked men. The trap was sprung. They were sealed in. Before the dust had even begun to settle, Jed fired again. He wasn't aiming for Silas or Cain. He was thinning the herd. His second shot took a gunman out of his saddle, a clean shot through the chest. The man fell without a sound. Jed worked the lever action of the Winchester, his movements fluid and economical. Crack! Another man fell, clutching his throat. Crack! A horse went down, screaming, trapping its rider's leg beneath it. Chaos erupted. The hired guns, unable to see their attacker, began firing wildly at the canyon walls, their bullets ricocheting with angry whines. It was exactly what Jed wanted. They were wasting ammunition and revealing their positions. "Stop firing, you fools!" Cain's voice cut through the din, sharp and authoritative. "You're shooting at ghosts. Take cover." Under Cain's direction, the remaining men scrambled for the meager cover offered by the rocks and boulders on the canyon floor. Silas, his fine suit now covered in dust, had dismounted and was huddled behind his dead horse, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. Jed had already abandoned his first position. While the dust and confusion reigned, he had slipped along the ledge, moving to his second pre-prepared nest further down the canyon. From his new vantage point, he had a different angle on the trapped men. He waited for a full minute, letting the silence and fear work on them. "Show yourself, you coward!" Silas screamed, his voice raw with fury. "Jed, I know it's you. Face me like a man." Jed's only answer was the crack of his rifle. The man with the trapped leg, who had finally managed to pull himself free, made a desperate run for a larger cluster of rocks. He didn't make it 5 feet before Jed's bullet took him in the back. Now there were 7 of them left, Silas, Cain, and 5 hired guns. The sun beat down on the canyon floor, turning it into an oven. There was no escape. The rock walls were too high, the landslide blocked the entrance, and somewhere above them, a phantom gunman was picking them off one by one. The hunters had become the hunted. Jed lay on the ledge, his cheek pressed against the warm wood of his rifle stock. He was patient. He had all the time in the world. This was his anvil, and he was just beginning to hammer. The canyon became a furnace. The sun climbed to its zenith, reflecting off the pale rock walls and baking the men trapped on the floor. Their canteens, filled in anticipation of a short ride, were already running low. Fear, like thirst, was a dry fire in their throats. They huddled behind the scant cover of boulders, their eyes scanning the high ledges, seeing nothing but heat, shimmer, and shadow. They were trapped in a coffin with the lid slowly closing. Jed was a master of this new, cruel game. He understood that the real battle was not against their bodies, but their minds. He used the canyon itself as an instrument of psychological torture. He would fire a single shot, not at a man, but at a rock face just above their heads. The bullet would ricochet with a terrifying, unpredictable scream, showering them with stone chips and dust, reminding them that no cover was truly safe. Then, silence. Minutes would stretch into an hour. The tension would build until it was an almost physical thing. Just as they would begin to relax, to believe the shooter was gone, another shot would crack from a completely different direction, renewing the terror. Down below, Silas's authority was crumbling. He was a man of boardrooms and back alley deals, not open warfare. His fine suit was torn, his face was streaked with grime, and his eyes held the wild, cornered look of an animal. "We have to do something," he snarled at Cain, who was calmly observing the ledges, his expression as placid as ever. "We can't just sit here and die." "What do you suggest?" Cain asked, his voice flat. "He is high, we are low. He has water and patience. We are running out of both. To move is to die. To stay is to die slowly. There has to be a way out the other end of this canyon," Silas insisted. "There isn't," Cain stated. "I've ridden this territory. This gorge dead ends a mile from here at a sheer rock fall. The Apache call it the Devil's Anvil. You're hammered from above until you break." One of the hired guns, a young man with more bravado than sense, couldn't take the waiting. "To hell with this. I'm making a run for it back to the rock slide. I can climb that." "Don't," Cain commanded. But the man was already gone, scrambling from cover and sprinting back the way they came. He was fast, a desperate, zigzagging target. For a moment, it looked like he might make it. Then came the single, inevitable crack of the Winchester. The man's legs flew out from under him, and he tumbled into the dust, a dark stain spreading on his back. The remaining 4 hired guns looked at each other, their faces pale. Their loyalty was to coin, and a dead man can't spend his wages. Jed's next target was not a man, but their water. One of the men had left his horse, still laden with supplies, tethered behind a large boulder. Jed waited until the man broke cover, making a dash for the canteens on the saddle. As his hand touched the leather, Jed fired. The bullet tore through 2 of the canteens, sending precious water gushing into the thirsty sand. The man screamed in frustration and scurried back to cover, having gained nothing but a greater sense of despair. The long afternoon wore on. The sun began its slow descent, casting long, menacing shadows across the canyon floor. The heat lessened, but the thirst grew more acute. The silence from above was now more unnerving than the shooting. "He's toying with us," one of the remaining gunmen whispered, his voice cracking. "He's just waiting for dark. We'll have the advantage in the dark," another argued, though he didn't sound convinced. "He knows this land," Cain said quietly, dashing their hopes. "We do not. In the dark, we are blind. He is the owl. We are the mice." Silas finally broke. His arrogance and anger boiled over into a desperate, reckless plan. "Fine. We wait for dark. Then we all move at once. We'll find a way to climb out. He can't watch every part of this wall at once." "He has already won," Cain said, looking directly at Silas. "You brought us here for a map. You were arrogant. Now you have paid for it with the lives of 7 men. Perhaps it is time to cut our losses." "Never," Silas hissed, his face contorted. That gold is mine. This whole damn territory is mine. No ghost of a dead partner is going to take it from me. As dusk finally settled, shrouding the canyon in a deep purple gloom, Jed moved to his final position. It was lower on the canyon wall, in a dark alcove that overlooked the small spring that trickled from the rock to see the only other source of water. He knew their thirst would eventually drive them to it. He didn't have to wait long. Two of the hired guns, their throats raw, decided to risk it. They moved like wraiths through the gathering dark, their forms barely visible. They reached the spring, falling to their knees and drinking greedily. Jed let them drink. Mercy was not in his vocabulary, but a quick death was not what they deserved. After a few moments, he whistled, a low, haunting sound that mimicked a canyon wren. The two men froze, their heads snapping up. From the darkness, Jed spoke, his voice seeming to come from the rocks themselves. "Your pocket's full," he asked. "Was it worth it?" Before they could react, he fired two shots in quick succession. The twin muzzle flashes were blinding in the gloom. The two men fell, their bodies collapsing into the small pool, their blood turning the clear water a dark, sickening red. Now there were three: Silas, Cain, and one last, terrified gunman. The war of attrition was nearly over. The night was absolute. With no moon, the darkness in the canyon was as thick and black as ink. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the rocks and the ragged breathing of the three survivors. The last hired gun, a grizzled veteran named Corbin, had seen enough. He crawled over to where Silas and Cain were huddled. "I'm done, Cain," Corbin whispered, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. "This ain't a fight, it's a slaughter. Whoever that is up there, this is personal. I ain't dying for your gold." "You'll die if you run," Silas snarled. "I'll die if I stay," Corbin countered. He drew his pistol. "I want my horse. I'm riding for the far end of the canyon. Maybe Cain's wrong. Maybe there's a way out." "You're a fool," Cain said dispassionately. Corbin stood up, a defiant silhouette in the dark. "Better a living fool than a rich corpse." He took 2 steps before Jed's voice echoed from the cliffs above. "He's right, Silas. It's personal." The voice was followed by the roar of the Winchester. Corbin crumpled to the ground, his desperate gamble lost. And then there were two. Silas let out a choked, desperate laugh. "So, it's just us, Cain. Just like the old days. You and me against the world." Cain didn't answer. He was staring into the darkness, his head cocked as if listening to something only he could hear. He had been a tracker before he was a gunfighter. He was reading the subtle shifts in the wind, the echoes of Jed's voice, the direction of the last shot. While Silas was descending into panic, Cain was doing what he was paid to do. He was hunting. "He's on the eastern wall," Cain said softly. "About halfway up. He's moving south, towards the dead end." Slowly, deliberately, Cain began to move. He didn't run. He melted into the deeper shadows at the base of the cliff, his movements silent and fluid. He was a predator in his own right, stalking a more dangerous one. Silas, left alone, scrambled behind a large boulder, clutching a rifle to his chest, his brief moment of bravado gone. Jed, now armed only with his Colt, was indeed moving south. His plan was to circle around and come up behind them, ending it. But he had underestimated Cain. As he dropped down from a low ledge to the canyon floor, he sensed, more than saw or heard, a presence in the darkness. He froze. The world seemed to hold its breath. 10 yards away, a shadow detached itself from another shadow. It was Cain. Neither man spoke. There was no need for words. This was the inevitable conclusion, a meeting that had been ordained from the moment Cain had watched Silas pull the trigger. In the near-total darkness, a traditional quick draw was impossible. This was a battle of instinct and nerve. Cain fired first. The muzzle flash was a blinding flower of orange, and Jed felt a searing, white-hot pain rip through his left shoulder. He grunted, stumbling back, but his own gun was already in his hand. He didn't aim. He fired at the memory of the flash, a purely reflexive act. He heard a sharp intake of breath from the darkness, followed by the heavy thud of a body falling. Silence. Jed stood, his heart hammering, his wounded shoulder screaming. Was it a trick? He strained his ears, listening. He heard a faint, wet cough. He moved forward cautiously, his Colt extended, his feet making no sound on the sandy ground. He found Cain slumped at the base of the rock wall. Jed's shot had been a lucky one, catching him in the chest. In the faint starlight, Jed could see Kane's eyes were open and lucid. There was no fear in them, only a detached, professional curiosity. "You're fast," Kane rasped, a trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth. "Faster than I thought." "It's over, Kane," Jed said, his voice strained with pain. Kane gave a weak, bloody chuckle. "It was always over. From the moment he pulled the trigger on you. A man like Silas, he builds his empires on sand. Sooner or later, the wind comes." He coughed again, a deep, rattling sound. "He has your locket. The one with the girl. Keeps it in his vest." Jed's knuckles whitened on the grip of his Colt. "Do me a favor," Kane whispered, his voice fading. "Don't let him beg." His eyes glazed over, and his head slumped to the side. Kane, the silent, deadly shadow, was gone. Jed stood over the body for a long moment. He felt a strange, hollow respect for the man. Kane had been a killer, but he had lived and died by a code. He was a product of this harsh land, just as Jed now was. He tore a strip of cloth from his shirt and made a crude sling for his arm. The pain was immense, but the fire of his vengeance burned hotter. He turned his gaze toward the far end of the canyon, where the last man was hiding in the dark. The ghost and the gunfighter were gone. Now, only the Viper remained. Silas heard the gunshots, then the terrible, profound silence that followed. He knew Kane was dead. He was alone. The architect of this grand betrayal, the man who saw himself as a king, was now just a terrified man huddled behind a rock in the dark, hunted by the ghost he had created. Jed walked slowly, deliberately, down the length of the canyon. His boots crunched on the gravel, the sound echoing off the high walls. He made no attempt at stealth now. He was the executioner, and the time for hiding was over. His wounded shoulder throbbed with every step, a burning reminder of the price of his revenge. "It's just you and me now, Silas," Jed's voice boomed, carrying the weight of judgment. "Nowhere left to run." Silas began to babble, his voice high and thin with panic. "Jed, listen to me. It was a mistake. A terrible mistake. We can still be partners. The gold, it's all yours. I don't want it." Jed kept walking, the sound of his footsteps a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of impending doom. He emerged into the open space at the end of the canyon. In the faint starlight, he could see Silas scrambling away from his rock, his face a pale mask of terror. "Stay back," Silas shrieked, fumbling with his rifle. He raised it and fired wildly. The bullet went wide, striking the canyon wall a dozen feet from Jed. Jed stopped, standing 20 feet away. He didn't even raise his Colt. He just stared at the pathetic, trembling figure before him. "You were always a coward, Silas. You hide behind other men's guns, other men's loyalty. Now there's no one left to hide behind." "I'll give you anything," Silas pleaded, dropping the rifle and raising his hands. "Money, land, anything you want." "I want what you took from me," Jed said, his voice a low growl. "I want the life you stole. But since you can't give me that, I'll settle for the locket." Silas's eyes widened. He fumbled in his vest pocket and pulled out the small, silver locket. It glinted in the starlight. "Here, take it. It's yours. Just let me go. I'll ride out and you'll never see me again, I swear." He held it out like a ward against evil. "Throw it," Jed commanded. Silas tossed the locket. It landed in the dust halfway between them. Jed didn't move to pick it up. He kept his cold and wavering gaze locked on Silas. "Now," Jed said softly, "you get to die the way you left me, bleeding in the dust." He raised his Colt. Silas screamed and, in a final act of sniveling cowardice, turned to run. Jed fired once. The bullet struck Silas in the leg, exactly as Grizzly's had been struck. Silas went down, howling in agony, clutching his shattered limb. Jed walked forward, his face an impassive mask of stone. He stood over the writhing, weeping man who had once been his friend. He looked down at Silas, and for the first time, he saw him not as a viper or a monster, but as something small and pathetic. A creature consumed by a greed so profound it had destroyed everything it touched. Chayden's words returned to him. "The fire will burn everything inside you, leaving only ash." He felt it now. A vast, hollow emptiness. The burning rage that had driven him for months was gone, replaced by a cold, gray stillness. The vengeance was complete, but it had not healed him. It had only scoured him clean. He knelt, ignoring Silas's pleas, and picked the locket from the dust. He opened it. Eleanor's gentle, smiling face looked up at him from the tiny photograph. He had done this for her, for the memory of the life they were supposed to have. But the man looking at her picture was a stranger, a hard, violent man she would not have recognized. He snapped the locket shut and put it in his own pocket. He then looked at Silas, who was staring up at him, his eyes wide with the final, dawning comprehension of his fate. "Please, Jed, mercy." Jed remembered Cain's last words. "Don't let him beg." He raised the Colt, the barrel steady despite the fire in his shoulder. "Mercy," he said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth, was left behind in the dust. He pulled the trigger. The final shot echoed in the devil's anvil, a full stop at the end of a long and bloody sentence. Jed stood there for a long time as the silence of the mountains reclaimed the canyon. He looked at the bodies of the men he had killed, at the stolen gold still packed on the dead mules. It meant nothing to him. It was a poison that had corrupted everything. He turned and, without a backward glance, began the long walk out of the canyon. He left the gold. He left the bodies for the coyotes and the vultures, a fitting tribute to the men who had left him to the same fate. All he took with him was the locket in his pocket, the pain in his shoulder, and the profound, aching emptiness in his soul. As the sun rose, casting its first golden rays over the peaks, a lone figure rode away from the Superstition Mountains. He was no longer Jedediah Stone, the prospector, nor was he the ghost of vengeance. He was someone else, forged in betrayal and tempered in blood. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he was riding away from the past, towards an unknown horizon, a solitary man with a single, faded photograph to remind him of the man he once was, and a lifetime of scars to remind him of what he had become. The dust settled behind him, and the desert kept its secrets once more.